All right, we've talked about expansionary uh, and contractionary fiscal policy. We've talked about whether the policy is discretionary or automatic. I want to say one more thing about automatic stabilizers. The progressive tax system is the most important one. A progressive tax system is one which rises with GDP. As people make more money, they pay more in tax. It might be something as, this is a highly simplified example, but you pay 10% of your first $20,000, 20% of your second 20,000, anything over 40, you pay 30%. So that for each of those higher increments, you pay a higher proportion. This is good for two reasons. One, it's just and fair. A rich person may say, well, why shouldn't we have a flat tax for everyone? That would be a proportional tax system where everybody pays 10%. I make $1 million. I pay $100,000 in taxes. This poor guy over here, he makes $10,000. He pays $1,000. That's fair. But it's really not, because the guy that makes the million still has $900,000 left to live on. And the guy that makes $10,000, he pays only one, true, but he was going to use that $1,000 to buy food. The 10% is a lot more devastating to him than it is to the rich person. But let's say you don't buy that. You don't care about rich people. Americans think we're all going to be, or poor people rather. Americans think we're all going to be rich anyway. So there's still another good reason to embrace a progressive tax system, because it acts as an automatic stabilizer. GDP and income rise, it sucks more money out, preventing a bubble. As GDP and income falls, it sucks less money out, putting a floor under GDP. And since Congress can't seem to agree on fiscal policy, the fact that this automatic stabilizer is working in spite of them is very, very helpful. One more thing, there is something called a regressive tax system, which is the opposite of progressive. It's one in which the more money you make, the less you pay, and the less money you make, the more you pay. This is obviously harmful to poor people, and also is destructive to the business cycle. It makes boom times boomier and bust times bustier. No policymaker would intentionally put in place a regressive tax system, but they happen unintentionally. And Alabama has a very regressive tax system. I've got a little article I want you to read about that later. That's enough about taxes. Let's talk about, I've been talking in abstract terms, so let's look at actual numbers in history, a brief history of U.S. fiscal policy. I'm going to start in 1990. And rather than give you actual numbers of deficits or surpluses, X trillion or 200 billion, that wouldn't make sense. It's important to look at the deficit or surplus as a percentage of GDP. Because we may have a deficit of $100 billion, and that sounds bad, but it's a percent of GDP, that's not a big deal. Whereas a deficit of $100 billion for France would be catastrophic. So we have to look at this percent of GDP. We have a giant economy, so it puts it in perspective. All right. These negative numbers mean deficits. In 1990, there was a recession in 1991, and so Congress, the government said, well, we should practice some expansionary policy, and they did. And things got better, but deficits were projected to continue after the recovery, and so taxes were raised in 1993. Because that was the fiscally responsible thing to do. And this eventually yielded surpluses. You see that in 1998, 99, 2000, 2001, these are positive numbers. The U.S. was making more money than it was spending. And this was in part, this was neither, Republicans or Democrats can claim this. This was a bipartisan effort. Republican Congress under Newt Gingrich and President Bill Clinton, after much fighting, agreed to put in place a balanced budget, and this was the result. It's very good. Then President George W. Bush was elected, and he said, and this made sense, he said, look, this is not right. The government is making a profit. Now, by the way, it was using that money, of course, to pay down previous debts. When you run a budget deficit, you have to borrow the money by issuing bonds. And so when you have a surplus, you can pay back some of that money. He said, nonetheless, the economy is growing, and the outstanding debt is not that bad, and we're spending, we're taking more money than we need for spending, and so that's your money. We should cut taxes, and that made sense. And so taxes were cut, and that made sense. It was helpful because there was a mild recession in 2000, 2001. You may recall the dot-com bubble burst. And so this lower taxes was kind of unintended expansionary fiscal policy that kind of made that recession fairly mild. Then an unfortunate number of things happened at the same time. Excuse me. 9/11 happened, and we launched a war in Afghanistan. Then a costly war was launched in Iraq in 2003. These combined wars were very expensive. $10 billion a month for years and years. And in addition to that, but you fight a war, you do what you got to do. They're expensive. But President Bush also wanted to be known for some domestic achievement, and so there was something called Medicare Part D that was created. The Medicare, the government-run healthcare insurance for retired people, did not have very good drug benefits, and the retired folks need a lot of medications, and so Part D was put in place to provide them with help in paying for their medications. Controversial at first, now wildly popular. But old people take a lot of drugs, and drugs are expensive, and this benefit was vastly more expensive than anticipated. So you have the cost of these wars, the cost of this health care, and so as you see, deficits start getting pretty big again. 2004, they peaked at negative 3.5%, 3.5% of GDP. And taxes were continuing to be lowered. This was the controversial part. The good news is the economy was exploding. It was growing, and so revenue flow. So the denominator of percent of GDP was getting bigger, making the total number smaller, and money was flowing into the government. So as you see, we still got deficits, but in 2007, the deficit declined to negative 1.2%. And then, then all hell broke loose. We have the Great Recession, and Democrats and Republicans agreed we've got to do some massive expansionary policy to save the economy. Unfortunately, we already had these deficits, so the result is in 2009, the first $1 trillion deficit, negative 11.2% of GDP was the deficit. And of course, the economy was wrecked, and this continued. They have these huge numbers. You'll notice, however, that last year we're getting down to a more reasonable deficit again. How did that happen? The tax cuts implemented in the Bush years were intended to expire, and they kept renewing them. And President Obama kept signing the renewals because we didn't want to raise taxes in the midst of this awful recession, and so they finally expired, though, and so taxes went up. And the administration in Congress, Republican Congress, had agreed that if they couldn't agree on a budget, then these automatic, really stupid, across-the-board cuts in spending would go into effect. And they thought, well, we'll have to agree because these are so stupid. Well, they didn't agree, and the stupid cuts went into effect. This was called the fiscal cliff, the simultaneous implementation of cuts. It's called sequestration, and the simultaneous sunsetting, expiration of these lower taxes. But you know what? The economy was recovering nicely, and the government was forced to be a little bit more fiscally responsible, and so the deficits are declining, and you know, it's all okay.